what I'll do today is show you some slide presentations, but please don't treat this as an ordinary lecture. What I intend to do is to discuss some cases with you. Although I discuss a few points, the main thing is to look at some cases and then to answer some questions that will be raised concerning these cases. Okay, so in the process, I hope that as you try to learn from what I say, I could also learn from your interaction. Okay. So the main subject of these presentations is scientific integrity and research misconduct. I'll start actually with a presentation on ethics and integrity in research. But I will be switching from one slide presentation to another as we move forward. Okay. So let me start with this quotation from C.P. Snow in a book entitled The Search. And C.P. Snow says, the only ethical principle which has made science possible is that the truth shall be told all the time. Okay, so if we may summarize this principle, we can say it is the principle of truthfulness. And he says further, a false statement of fact made deliberately is the most serious crime that a scientist can commit. Okay? So basically the same thing about the need to be truthful. And if we're talking about truthfulness, then there is the corollary principle about trust. Because if we assume that everybody has to be telling the truth, then we also have to take into account the belief that every other person has about the other person telling the truth. And it is about trust. And it is this trust that is at the foundation of science and scientific discovery. When someone discovers something, when someone publishes something in science and says, this is what I have found, then others will tend to build on what has been said or what has been discovered or what has been established and so on. So it becomes a building block that others will build other building blocks upon. Okay? So the next question then is, as with someone who might be giving a lecture like this, if the most important thing is truthfulness and trust, how can you teach truthfulness and trust? Okay? And Derek Bock, a former president of Harvard University, famously published an article entitled, Can Ethics Be Taught? Why would he ask something like that? Isn't it, ethics is an important foundation, and therefore we just assume that ethics is something that can be taught. Okay? But he had to raise this question, and actually after he raised the question, he proceeded to say why it couldn't be taught. Okay? So here is someone trying to convince everybody that ethics is important, and then he proceeds to say, oh, I think there are so many reasons why ethics cannot be taught. And what are those reasons? Let's look at the reasons, at some of the reasons. Well, one can say, no, you cannot teach ethics because it does not pay. In other words, it does not pay to be ethical. Okay. What do you mean by that? Well, here is an observation commonly made by a few. You cannot teach ethics because it does not pay. And the observation is, well, students seem to see things in cost-benefit terms. Not only students, but most people actually see things, a lot of things, in cost-benefit terms. I mean, if somebody tells you, you have to do this, or we have to do this, the question usually is, why? What will happen if we don't do this? Okay? And that question is usually answered in terms of cost-benefit. You know, it will cost you something. It will do you harm. It will not lead to good results if you don't do this. Okay? So the observation made by one of the teachers that Derek Bock was talking to was, well, students seem to see things in cost-benefit terms. Even if you talk about lying or telling the truth, the question is, will the lie serve a good policy? So if when you lie you'll get good results, then it should be okay to lie, or at least it seems to be okay to lie. And what are the chances of getting caught? And if you get caught at all, aren't you going to be able to avoid any harm? And if you are able to, then it should be okay. It's okay to lie. Another reason given why ethics cannot be taught is it gets in the way of results. What do I mean it gets in the way of results? There's one phrase you might have heard, medicine that can't wait. Medicine is just an example, but there are a lot of things that can't wait. In other words, there are a lot of things that we need. There are a lot of things that we have to pursue, and medicine might be one of them. And you cannot wait. If you're waiting for medicine, if you need medicine, you have to get it right away. And if you have to be ethical, then being ethical can get in the way. We'll explain later on as we proceed what that might mean. And that's related to the next point, which is no, you cannot teach ethics because it hinders research. And someone even asked, are research ethics bad for our mental health? Isn't it bad that we have to be ethical? Because when we try to be ethical, like when you still have to get informed consent from someone before you treat him or before you do research, then you might not get the consent that you need. But if you don't get the consent that you need, then how can you proceed to do research? So the way usually that we want to proceed is we think we need to get this and that, we need to have informed consent, and it will constitute battery, for instance, if you try to treat someone and you don't have consent. But then there are those who would say, oh, but that presents a hindrance to moving forward, to doing research. And then there is the matter of conflicts of interest. No, there are so many interests. We cannot teach ethics because there are so many interests pushing us to move quickly and in other different directions. What do I mean by that? Immanuel Kant, that philosopher that some of you would have heard of, is thought to have said, ought implies can. That is, if you say you ought to do something, it must be possible for you to do that which you ought to do. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. In other words, if I say, well, you ought to be quiet, but if you cannot be quiet, then it does not make sense because there's no way that you can do what you ought to do. So ought implies can. Now this is a kind of parody because it puts things the other way around. It says can implies ought. What does that mean? There are so many things that we feel now that we must do just because we can do them. Okay? In other words, technology has made so many things possible for us to do, and because technology has made those things possible, we feel we ought to try them. I mean, that's just part of being curious. That's part of being scientific. That's part of being a human being. When there is something that you had not done before, now it becomes possible to do it, you feel you must do it. So it's sort of the reverse. You know? There are so many things that computers have made possible, so many things that other kinds of technology have made possible. Just because you can do it, now you feel you ought to do it. You know? iPad comes along. There are so many things now that you can do because of iPad, then you feel you must do them. Even if before they didn't make sense. You didn't feel that they were important, but just because it is there already, you feel you ought to do it. So the feeling we have is let's do it because we can. And if you feel let's do it because you can, then you think, well, it doesn't make too much sense to be ethical if there are these things that you can do. Then the next question that might arise is, well, why do I talk about conflicts of interest? I talk about conflicts of interest at this point because if we don't feel that it is so necessary to be ethical, that there is a need to be ethical, maybe we need some kind of reminding. But this would be self-explanatory. What do I mean by conflicts of interest? Conflicts of interest refers to those situations where you have to do something. Okay? You have an interest in doing something, which is the ethical interest. But at the same time, some other interest comes along. Okay? Let's say a lawyer is supposed to be defending a client in court, but then in the course of defending the client in court, there is a conflicting interest that arises. The lawyer discovers that the opposing lawyer is someone with whom he has some kind of common investment, and that investment might be jeopardized if he continues to defend this client. So there is a conflict. But how do you resolve a conflict like that? Okay. But for the moment, let's talk about conflicts of interest in the area of medicine and see how it works. Okay, this is what I explain here are things that have been shown by empirical research about how physicians behave. You know what grand rounds are? No. Grand rounds are, well, what you would have in medical school when you have someone talking about a particular topic, maybe a new type of medicine. Okay. And this new type of medicine is sponsored by a pharmaceutical company. Now, how does conflict of interest work? Okay. The findings are, from this research, physicians, if they attend the grand rounds given by a pharmaceutical company speaker, are more likely to prescribe that company's drug even if many of them did not recall what company sponsored the talk. Okay? So there is a talk given by a speaker. This talk is sponsored by the pharmaceutical company. Later on in the research, these doctors who attended are asked, and it is determined that they will prescribe this medicine even if they don't remember that this company sponsored the talk. So they don't even have to be persuaded consciously. They just get persuaded subconsciously. And the physicians will think, oh, I am not affected by conflicts of interest. You know, they feel that they are objective, as everybody does. I'm not just speaking of some physicians or of physicians. Everybody seems to be like that. When something goes wrong, the first thought that comes to our minds is, oh, I'm objective enough not to be affected. But I don't know, the other doctors, they might be affected. Okay? I'm not affected, but other physicians are affected by conflicts of interest in their decisions. And the researchers also went on and asked patients what they think. And what do the patients think about conflicts of interest? The patients think, oh, other physicians are affected by conflicts of interest, but my physician is not. If I were a doctor, I think I am not affected, other doctors are affected. If I am a patient, I'd think my doctor is not affected, but other doctors are affected. So the point is that self-interest distorts the way that people weigh arguments. Even when people accept that they are biased, they tend to underestimate how strong that bias is. So they know that sometimes they are biased, but when they know they are biased, they underestimate how deep that bias goes. And even in small stakes, you see, in medical practice, sometimes they will say, okay, let us try to remove the effect of what the pharmaceutical companies give. Let's say you cannot receive books from them, you cannot receive tickets to travel to conferences. It's okay to receive ballpoint pens or writing pads because those are just small presents. You will not be affected by those small presents. But that is a mistake according to these researchers. They say bias arising from conflicts is strong even in studies with very small stakes. Limiting the size of a gift that you receive from a pharmaceutical company is not likely to eliminate a bias. And individuals are not aware of their bias even when they are taught about it. And how does it affect the performance of physicians in more specific ways? For example, it has been shown that physicians who work for a pharmaceutical company might select an inappropriate comparator. You know, when you have research to compare one drug with another drug, what they would do is to select a comparator that is not actually comparable. In other words, if you want to compare your drug with another drug, say for a headache, you choose another drug that you know is weaker, so that when you have the study, you'll make it appear that you have a very good product. And then when you write about it in a paper, you also will want to use a kind of bias, meaning you're not very objective in writing about it. So let's skip a few slides. The main point behind this is to say that the good guys, the doctors that we know, are not always as good as they seem to be. And we all need to be reminded about that. Okay? But let me explain a bit more why we need some reminding. And this is about ghost writing. What do I mean by ghost writing? Well, you've heard about people being ghost writers, right? Have you? When you have to write something, when you're, say, a member of parliament, you don't have time to be writing your speeches. So you have a ghost writer. You have someone who writes for you, okay? Because you don't have time to do it. And everybody knows, actually, that when you deliver a speech, it is a speech that someone, a ghost writer, has written for you. And sometimes people listening to the speech will be guessing, I think that kind of speech would have been written by this person I know. That's a kind of game that listeners to the member of parliament will be playing. Or you have a State of the Nation address. Do you have that? Every year, a State of the Nation address delivered by the president in Taiwan? Okay, so he delivers a speech, and even 1 month or 2 months before the speech, people are talking about who is preparing the speech. So you have several ghostwriters. Okay? No problem. People know that because the person who gives the speech really doesn't have the time to prepare the speech. Okay? But in the end, he is the person who gives the speech. He is principally responsible for what he says. Okay? Now, why is it a problem in the pharmaceutical industry? Sometime in 2009, for example, have you heard about hormone replacement therapy? Maybe you haven't because you're not old enough to have needed it. But your mothers maybe have needed hormone replacement therapy. That's when they become menopausal. And when they become menopausal, they are so cranky and they have hot flushes, women, that is. So for some time, it was very popular that women of menopausal stage would have hormone replacement therapy. And then sometime during that period, it was discovered, well, not in 2009, but earlier, it was discovered that HRT, or hormone replacement therapy, was causing cancers. Okay? So it was leading to women having cancer. But what was discovered later, after that, was that papers were being written during that period to support hormone replacement therapy by ghost writers. What does that mean? Suppose I were a famous doctor, practitioner, a gynecologist, a doctor for women who are of menopausal stage. I would be asked to write a paper by a pharmaceutical company, but actually the paper would have been written by people from that same pharmaceutical company that sells the drugs. Okay. So the paper would be published in my name, taking advantage of my name and my popularity, even if I have nothing to do with the research leading to that paper. Do you get the point? No? So the paper is published in my name. The paper says, this HRT is excellent. It leads to these results, and the results are such and such, like this and like that, and so on and so forth. So it is published in my name. Actually, the people who did the research are people I might not even know. They are people from the pharmaceutical company. So you have a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest, why? Because the people who wrote the paper are people who want to sell the drug. Okay? And if the people who wrote the paper are people who want to sell the drug, then you know what they are going to say in the paper. They're going to say, it is excellent, it has led to good results, its side effects are negligible, they are not so important, you don't have to worry about the side effects. Okay. So, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, they put together several papers and discovered that in those papers, there was a pattern of guest authorship and ghost writing. So what happens is that the review manuscripts were often prepared by unacknowledged authors, authors who were nameless, and subsequently they were attributed to academically affiliated investigators who often did not disclose what the pharmaceutical industry was paying them. So the next question then is, well, clearly there was deception there, but the next question now is, can deception be avoided? So how do we avoid deception? In matters of authorship, for example. So here's one case, not so much a pharmaceutical industry case, but a case involving creative authorship. So you have a case of Dr. S, who is a surgeon, and I want to ask you some questions pertaining to this. Dr. S is a surgeon who is expected to contribute tissue that are to be used as samples for a research project. Okay. He's just being approached because he is a surgeon, and as a surgeon, he can excise tissue from the human subject as required, according to the specifications of the research team. But he knows that one of the outputs of the research team is going to be a publication reporting the outcome of the procedures involving the collected tissue samples. Dr. S requests that he be listed as an author of the article to be submitted for publication. Okay? You need me, this is the surgeon talking, you need me for your project, and I'm so important for your project, you cannot proceed without me, and since you cannot proceed without me, I am so important, why don't you include me as an author? You know how authorship is important nowadays. You don't get promoted if you don't have enough authored publications. You can even be kicked out of the department if you don't have publications. So that is very important. So the surgeon says, well, I don't have time to write, maybe, and I was not involved in this project from the beginning, but I am indispensable for your project. So the question is, does he deserve to be listed as one of the authors? Just common sense. Now, do you think he deserves to be listed? because of his importance for the project? What do you think? Don't worry about.
It is really important in this project, but it doesn't contribute his efforts to write the article. I don't think he deserves to be this.
So he does not contribute to the writing itself, and so he does not deserve to be an author. Do you agree with him? Or you think there might be some reason to disagree?
I guess in practice, it will be listed on the paper. The doctor will be listed on the paper because without him, the article cannot be done. In practice, I know.
So you think it might be okay that he be acknowledged as an author?
Because without him, everything will be.
So he may not contribute directly to the writing, but he contributes in a significant way. Yeah? So with whom do you side between the two?
I think both of them are right because if Dr. S. he did provide the substantial contribution to this paper, he deserves to put his name on the article. But if his contribution was not related to the academic contribution, that might not be worth him to this article.
If it does not relate directly to the writing, then he might not deserve. Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying the paper might not be published if he does not do what is expected of him, and therefore he deserves to be an author? Yeah. Any other views on this?
I agree with Peter, and I think both
Please use the mic.
I think because Dr. S. He contributes tissues, and I think it's okay to be listed as one of the authors.
Okay. What about this? During one conference, when this very same case was discussed, someone answered in reply to that point. You see, after the tissue is collected, there is also a need for a runner to have an iced container, a refrigerated container to put the tissue in, because otherwise it will deteriorate, okay? So he has to be there in the room waiting, and when the tissue is available, he has to put it in that refrigerated container and then run to the laboratory within so many minutes and make it available for the next step. Without this runner, this project will not prosper, okay? So like the surgeon, he has a contribution that is essential. But will you want this person to be an author of this publication?
I think it's different because the runner can be replaced by others. But the Dr. S cannot be replaced by others.
Okay, so you have another reply again. Okay, this the role may be indispensable, but the person who plays that role is replaceable in this case. It can be almost anybody else. That's what you're saying, right? And therefore, although the role is important, the person who plays that role is not so important as to be named as an author. Okay, okay, very, very important points. But let's look at the criteria that are respected, that are used or recognized as requirements for authorship. Okay. And what I'm quoting here is a document called Uniform Requirements coming from the ICMJE. The ICMJE is the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors. Okay? While it is a committee of medical journal editors, what they say has been recognized not just by medical journal editors, by other publications as well. So this is the generally recognized set of requirements for authorship. What do they say? For someone to be recognized as an author, that person must make substantial input to one of the following: conception and design, acquisition of data, and analysis and interpretation of data. So at least one of these three. But not only that, okay? At least one of these three, plus drafting the article or revising it for intellectual content. And there is one more: final approval of the version to be published. In other words, if I cannot say, oh, I don't approve of that, if I say, no, you can't publish that, but they will not listen to me, the other authors, then I cannot be considered an author. I must be so important for the publication that if I say, you cannot possibly publish that, they will listen. If that is not my status, then I cannot be an author. So there are these requirements, and it seems that even the surgeon will not meet all the three requirements, right? But I'm not stopping there. What I want to say is, okay, in this particular case, the surgeon cannot be recognized as an author, but there is still that feeling, I'm sure among all of us, there's still that feeling that somehow it is quite unfair to the surgeon if he were not to be recognized as an author, right? I mean, strictly speaking, if you just go by these rules, he cannot be an author. And if he were to be listed as an author just on the basis of what he has done, we are somehow deceiving the public. In other words, the reader, if he says, okay, this surgeon is an author, will somehow think that the surgeon has contributed in these ways. But he has not. So there will be some amount of deception if he were to be listed as an author, right? However, as I said, we don't feel too good about it. Somehow, it is not fair to him because he is so important to the project and the publication, right? So, what could be the solution? The solution might be this. Perhaps we should anticipate situations like that so that we should involve, as a team, if we were part of the team, we should involve the surgeon as a collaborator from the beginning. The point is to try to be as truthful as possible. If there are rules, then let's try not to break the rules, but let's try to observe those rules in a creative way. Okay? Because we have to build on a foundation of trust. Do you get what I mean? I mean, we will feel that it is unfair to the surgeon if he were not to be listed as an author. So let's try to find ways, let's try to be creative in our approach in order that he can validly be one of the authors. Okay. So the point is still about trying to avoid deception. But let's take up another example this time, maybe a bit more interesting for you. And this is about necessary deception in research. And this involves a research project about negotiating safe sex practices. The way the case goes is like this. There is this study to examine whether and how women in the sex trade negotiate or try to convince their customers to use a condom. Okay? So you have women involved in the sex trade. As women, they have to try to convince their customers to use a condom. Otherwise, they risk getting infected with sexually transmitted diseases. Okay? So the point is, the objective is to help reduce the incidence of HIV, AIDS in the population of women who are involved in the sex trade. Okay? Now, this is a study primarily done by this anthropologist who was concerned that if women were to be asked directly, okay, the idea was simply to interview the women. But he was concerned that if the women were to be asked directly, they might not answer truthfully. I mean, when you ask women about how they convince their customers about the use of a condom, you'll not expect to get correct answers all the time. So the way this methodology was conceived was to involve participant observation that used some kind of deception. And the idea was to do this. The researchers were to pose as male customers who casually met women in one of the venues to negotiate for sex. Okay, do you follow the case so far? Okay. They would then ask the women how, why, and with whom they bartered casual sex. But at a certain point, they would have to find a way to escape without engaging in sex. Okay, if you were the researchers here, the males, for example, if you were to be the researchers, you want to become researchers, but you don't want to stay until after you have sex with the women, right? Or am I mistaken in that assumption? So they submitted this proposal, as with other proposals, to an ethics committee, and the ethics committee thought the methodology provided a good opportunity to gain valuable insights that would provide a good basis for policy making. And to compensate for wasting the women's time, the decision was made to pay them. Okay, the women were to get paid anyway, even if they didn't have sex. But later on, when it was due for publication, one of the peer reviewers objected, saying that there was deception in this research. Okay. So the research, in the actual case, the research was completed already. The ethics committee approved it, but the reviewer of the publication was the one who later objected. She said, no, we cannot publish that because there was deception. And because there was deception, now there was the threat of this paper, which would have been very useful, not getting published. Okay? So the question is, was Dr. J justified in doing research founded on deception? In other words, okay, now you have the publication submitted to this peer reviewer. Can you give a reason to the peer reviewer why this study should be published? Do you think you can convince that reviewer to approve the publication anyway? What would you say? What reasons can be given?
And the research is just the absorption to the prosecutors. The prosecutors doesn't know they did a deception. They didn't know they lied to them. They lied to them. So actually, the answer is zero. Just yes, the way he did is a deception, but the research is not a deception because the prosecutors doesn't lie to the researchers.
Okay, you're saying the data collected would be okay because the women did not lie to the researchers. So it should be accurate data. If it is accurate data, then maybe it is okay to publish. Okay? But the objection of the peer reviewer is not so much the validity or invalidity of the data as the fact that it was founded on a deceptive practice, a deceptive research practice. You approached the women, lied to them, and got this result. If you get results by lying, then that is not good. That's what the peer reviewer is saying. So it's not so much the validity of the data that is in question. It is the practice, the methodology used in research. Now, how can we convince the reviewer to approve anyway? Can we? Is it okay to say, were you about to say something?
Maybe we can find a perspective to protect these women's privacy.
To protect the women's privacy. Okay, you're saying one of the important concerns is privacy. Okay, you may have deceived them, but as long as you don't release their names, as long as you don't identify them, maybe it's okay, because privacy is an important concern and you can protect their privacy, right? But the reviewer might still say, well, okay, I see your point. Privacy is important and you want to protect the privacy, but I'm concerned about something else. I'm concerned about allowing researchers to proceed on the basis of deception. Remember, one of the first things we said during this presentation is trust in the scientific community. Trust is very important. How can you build on trust if you are trying to deceive? That's what the peer reviewer is saying.
But what if the deceiving is the only way to get the true data?
Okay. What if it is only by engaging in some kind of deception that you can get the correct data? Yeah? There's no other way, you might say. No other way. If you told the truth, in other words, if you didn't resort to deception, you would not have gotten correct results or reliable results. And if you don't have reliable results, you cannot help the women. So you're deceiving them, but it is for the purpose of helping those same women that you are deceiving. So isn't that okay?
I guess sometimes we can accept the white lie.
Yeah, like a white lie. Yeah. Yeah, as a matter of fact, one of the books that I'll be quoting later on is a book called Lying by Cicela Bock, the wife of the Derek Bock that we referred to in one of the articles. Okay? She wrote a book called Lying, and one of the things that she writes about is white lies. Her point throughout the book is to say, okay, we give so many excuses for lying, and white lies is one of those excuses. We say, oh, but this is only a white lie. This is not a serious lie. Okay? But what she is saying towards the end of her book, towards the conclusion is, well, let us try to limit the justifications we give for lying. Because we have so many justifications. Immanuel Kant, going back to that philosopher, Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher who is responsible for what is called rationality in ethics, or rational ethics. And one of the things he said was, the problem with having excuses for breaking rules is that if you are sometimes justified in breaking a rule, then people will not know when you are breaking a rule or not. Like promising. Kant said, when you promise, you have to keep your promise. Because if, let's assume, that you can sometimes be justified in breaking a promise, even if that were thought to be valid, then how do we know if I make a promise now, how do you know that I will really want to keep my promise? Can this not be one of those instances when I will later on say, oh, you see, there is a justification for breaking this promise this time? Do you get the point? Kant was making that point. So when you promise, you have to keep your promise at all costs. Now, I'm not about to endorse Kant now, and Cicela Bock does not actually say, let us do what Kant suggests. But she is saying, let us try at least to limit the justifications that we have for lying. Okay, so with that in mind, let's assume that you are at an earlier point in this research. In other words, you have not completed it yet. You're just about to start it. Can you think of a way of doing the research without engaging in deception? How might you proceed? Oh, no, but even before that, okay. Suppose you are at that point already. You submit the paper for publication and the peer reviewer says, oh no, because you deceived. What additional thing might you say in order to try to convince her? Of course, you can say, as we mentioned, that this is a necessary deception, right? You cannot get the results without deceiving. Okay, we had to deceive, but in addition, we promise after publication, or even now, we will go back to those women and tell them, look, we're sorry we approached you with this interview. Actually, we were doing a research. Now that the research is completed, we want to tell you the truth. This is what we did. Okay? So the term for this is debriefing. You know, in social science research, when you're sometimes forced to do some deception or to engage in some deception, after you engage in that deception, you have to do debriefing. So what that means is you go back to the people that you deceived and tell them, we're sorry, we deceived you, but there was no other way to do it. Now we apologize, and at least we make it up to you, we tell you the results, and we explain that it is because we want to help you. Okay? What do you think about that? Maybe useful, right? Actually, it is one of the things that social science researchers, anthropologists, medical anthropologists, medical sociologists usually would have to do if they are to engage in some deception at all. Okay. But my other question earlier was, would it not have been possible to avoid even that kind of deception in this case?
In that situation, maybe the results will be, let's say, correct.
Uh-huh.
The result should be totally different.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And some people actually say, this is one of those situations where complying too much with research ethics might be bad for our health. I mean, bad for the women's health. You know? And if you insist on research ethics in such a case, then you're actually being unethical because you prevent highly beneficial research. But there are maybe other ways. Suppose, and this is again one standard methodology. What do you think about it? Suppose the researchers go to the women beforehand and say, okay, I have to explain something to you. We're going to conduct research within the next 2 months, just for explanation. Within the next 2 months, one of our colleagues will come to you, pretend to be a customer, and then ask you a few questions. But he will not tell you that he is such a researcher. You will actually feel that he is a customer. So when he does that, he won't be deceiving you. At least when he deceives you, it will in effect be with your permission. Because we are now asking for your permission to do that sometime within the next 2 months. Would that be okay?
Maybe the prosecutors will also know might be the researchers.
That's why you do it within the next 2 months. You know, even if the woman knows that someone is going to appear in those 2 months, if she has customers every day, then she's likely to forget that this particular customer might be this researcher at this time. So she cannot be on guard every day within those 2 months. What do you think? Is that getting rid of the deception? Is that a good way of dealing with the deception? I mean, avoiding it? You don't think so? Why?
Yeah, because even, yes, maybe she will
soon. Or maybe the researchers already can. So maybe, okay, after him, everyone will be just normal customers to me. But there still has to, because these factors, this reason will influence her thinking, her reaction, and even her response. So I think it might be change their research.
But what if you don't tell the woman what the research exactly is all about? In other words, she will not know what questions will be asked. So it can be just any customer. In other words, it is one thing if I tell the woman, okay, one of our colleagues will come to you and ask you questions about negotiating to use a condom. No? I will not tell the woman that. I will just say, one of our co-researchers will approach you and ask questions. And the questions will be asked before she knows that this person is going to try to avoid sex. Okay? You get the point? In other words, up to that point, this interviewer is going to be like every other customer. Well, anyway, the point is this. We may still be able to find some way for the woman to suspect that this is the researcher. That is still possible, right? She may be so intelligent that she can tell. I mean, she's been in the business for, say, 5 years. She knows when someone approaches and this looks like an interviewer rather than a customer. You know, she might be that kind of woman, and therefore she might still be given a clue that this is it. I know he's the one who's come to interview me. But at least this research team is trying. Okay, this research team is trying, and this is better than being completely deceptive. Okay, so that's the point behind this methodology. The point is that science and scientific research is founded on trust, and every opportunity to try to avoid lying or being untruthful should be pursued. That's the point that is being made. Okay. It may not be perfect yet. It's still not perfect. There may still be some problems. But we have to try to do that. That's what Sisla Bock is saying. That's what these people are saying. Okay. Let's try every possible means to be truthful, because the scientific enterprise has to be truthful.
Yeah. Conclusion is the right way to do a research is more important than to get a correct answer.
It might come to that sometimes. Yeah, it might come to that sometimes. in the end, there has to be some balancing. Okay? In the end, there has to be some balancing done by the scientists. And especially in social science research, it is so difficult to avoid having to be at least a bit deceptive, because you have to engage in, you can't be telling the whole truth all the time. You know, it is so difficult when you're trying to discover people's attitudes, when you're trying to gather evidence about emotions and things of that sort. It is almost impossible not to deceive. Okay? But the point being made is, try as hard as you can. Don't make it so easy for people to lie. You know? Right? Okay. Maybe I should provide a further background for this. These conversations, these publications about lying and the scientific enterprise came in about the 1970s. Maybe you were not born yet at that time. But in the 1970s, that was a time after the Watergate scandal in the US. The Watergate scandal was when the Republican Party, you know, there are two parties in the US, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. What happened in Watergate was that the Republican Party authorized the use of listening devices in the Democratic Party headquarters. Okay? So that's a violation of privacy and confidentiality. But it was discovered, it was proven that they did that. So the whole conversation in society, not only in the US, but in other countries as well, because the president at that time, Richard Nixon, had to resign. You know, when a president has to resign, then that's something very important. And when the president of the most powerful nation in the world has to do that, every other nation listens. Okay? So everybody was interested. And the idea was, you have a president who lies. When you have a president who lies to his people, that is not good. You know? So that was the backdrop for this. And so it is in the scientific community. The scientific community has to be about truth, because that's what every scientist is trying to discover. What is the truth? And if you're trying to discover the truth, and your effort to discover the truth is founded on lies, then everything breaks down. No? It's so contradictory. Trying to discover the truth by lying. Okay, so as Sisla Bock says, trust and integrity are precious resources, easily squandered, and when you squander it, when you lose it, it's so hard to gain. They can thrive only on a foundation of respect for truth, and preventing research done unethically is not the same as preventing research altogether. So what we're trying to say is, we want to prevent the doing of research that is unethical, but we want research to be able to continue. And one must always try to find ways of conducting important research ethically. So be creative, find non-deceptive alternative methodologies. Okay. But that is not what this person is thought to have done. Okay? If you've been aware of what has been going on just recently, this well, it's embarrassing to talk about someone from my university, but that's what he is. He's from the National University of Singapore, who's now being investigated for fabricating research data. And then US says the reputation is not tarnished. I mean, although the university says the reputation of the university itself is not being tarnished because it is doing the investigation, the point is that you have this being talked about in various fora already. That's one example. That's another one. And there is the possibility of retracting. Well, those papers, those questionable papers have already been retracted or withdrawn from the journals. And there are 70 more papers by the same author that are being investigated right now. One of those papers for which she is known is something about roundworms, and it is a sad commentary on what he did, that now you find his picture interspersed with a picture of the roundworms that he was supposed to be studying. Okay. And you have other news items about such practices. In this particular case, about academic fraud in the mainland China. And this news item talks about it as being a betrayal of Confucius. Okay. And here is another famous one. The picture is that of Professor David Robinson, who, when this happened, was actually the Vice Chancellor of Monash University in Australia. The Vice Chancellor is the head of the university. So he was head of the University of Monash at the time that this news about his plagiarism came up. So a sad commentary also on the character. And he had to resign his presidency or his vice chancellorship of Monash University. Monash is, as you may know, one of the famous universities, the biggest actually in Australia. Okay, there are other examples that I can cite here. Let me just take you through some of this. Robert A. Millikan was even a Nobel Prize winner. He was Nobel Prize winner in 1923 for research that he did in 1913. But he was discovered 50 years later. He was actually dead. So he was quite lucky that when the discovery was made, he was dead already. Because had he been alive, it would have been very embarrassing that this was discovered. So as it was, he was resting peacefully already when the fraud, the misconduct was discovered. And in his case, it was merely, well, you won't be interested in it. Just the interesting thing about him was that he was a Nobel Prize winner. You've also heard of Dr. Wang Wusuk. Do you remember his name? Do you remember hearing about him? Wang Wusuk? No. Okay. But do you remember about a South Korean scientist who fabricated this claim about cloning? Okay. So you don't remember his name, but you remember this South Korean. But that's the important point I want to mention here. You see, he was disgraced. You may not remember his name, but you remember him being South Korean. You know, my point is, okay, if it were just a person, it might be okay, but the sad thing is, people remember the South Korean scientist, and it's sad because what he disgraced was not just himself, but in effect the country, because that is what people will remember, right? And I told you about that NUS scientist, okay? You will forget his name pretty soon, but you will remember somebody talked to you about the NUS scientist. That you will remember. And that's why it is even more embarrassing, it is even more sad that things like this will happen, because people will remember not the particular name, but the institutions or the countries that they represent. So I will not say more about him.